Sharecropper is becoming a young leader in this new growing civil rights movement. This was all captured by the media of the times. Let's take a look at that. Look closely at film and photos from the civil rights movement, and you see John Lewis's commitment and leadership in action. Here he is in historic newsreel footage from the Nashville sit-ins where well-organized students trained in nonviolence resisted brutal attacks and chipped away at discrimination in business practices. The Freedom Rides used nonviolent direct action to confront segregated transportation. John Lewis was among the first Freedom Riders. Pictures from the event show how he was seriously injured by racist mobs. Selma was the battleground for voting rights. There is young John Lewis on the front lines of the nonviolent march of Bloody Sunday. Pictures are worth 1,000 words, and images from the civil rights movement speak to the leadership of John Lewis. Some very powerful images and painful images. Representative Lewis, can you talk about the Nashville sit-ins, and do you believe that they were the catalyst for the movement?
The Nashville sit-ins, perhaps more than any other place in the South, was so well organized, so disciplined, because we had a wonderful teacher, young Methodist minister by the name of Jim Lawson. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. used to say that James Lawson had a better understanding of the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence than anyone he knew. We have what we call role-playing, social drama, where, and I know today young people have a lot of drama, but we had social drama, a real drama, where a group of black and white students would come together, high school students, college students. Blacks would play the role of whites, whites would play the role of blacks, and sometimes it would be an interracial group. Nashville was a segregated city. You can go downtown and buy something. If you want to buy a suit or a dress, you can try it on. That would be a restaurant, a lunch counter. You can take a seat. You have to get something and take it out on the street to eat. So we were taught to sit in, and we would go there in an orderly, peaceful, nonviolent fashion. Just sit all day, waiting to be served, reading a book, working on a paper, or looking straight ahead, and someone would come in and beat us, pull us off the lunch counter stool, pour hot water on us, hot coffee, hot chocolate, or spit on us, and we just look straight ahead.
While all that happened with the hot coffee and the cigarettes being put out in your hair, when you were looking straight forward, what was going through your mind? Like, what was, I know they say keep your eye on the prize, but what was that, what were you thinking about at that time?
But in a real sense, I was thinking what we have discovered in learning about nonviolence, that we were being tested and that we had to pass the test. And the great majority of us passed the test. We would be arrested in jail and taken off to jail. But because we didn't strike back, we appealed to the conscience of hundreds and thousands of citizens all across Nashville, black and white, who in turn supported us. And people around America saw these well-dressed high school students and college students sitting there, not fighting, not talking back, not laughing out, just bearing witness to what we believed in. It changed Nashville, and it led to the desegregation of all of the stores and lunch counters and restaurants.
I just wanted to ask, could you believe actually what was happening, that you were so outnumbered in sheer people that you felt, I mean, just hopeless, that there was nothing to be done further? I know you've already touched on it, but just again, there were just so many people there. Just how did you feel?
Well, sometimes I see the image and film footage of us being beaten, later arrested and put in the police wagon and taken to jail, and I see the mob cheering. It's hard for me to believe. It's difficult for me to believe sometimes that it really did happen. But it did happen, that fellow Americans, your fellow citizens, would treat you this way simply because you want to desegregate a lunch counter, a restaurant, or a theater. But it happened in America, And doing so, it changed things. So we come such a great distance because people were willing, brave and courageous young people. Some were so young to put their bodies on the line.
We're not as segregated. We still have like little segregations, like if you were at school, there might be blacks who sit with blacks and whites sit with whites. But are you happy with the outcome of how we are today and like the desegregation that we do have, or do you think we should still keep fighting?
Well, I'm very happy and very pleased that we've come such a distance, that we've come so far, but we still have a great distance to go. There's still too many people left out and left behind. And it's not just African American or black people in the American South, but all across America. Hispanics, Asian American, women, Native American. People have been put down because of their race, their color, and their gender. And it's not right, it's not fair. So anytime we see segregation or see discrimination or see someone being put down, we have to find a way to speak up and speak out and not be quiet.
Do you see yourself as a role model to the Native Americans? Like to the people that I look up to, do you think that you inspired them on anything?
Well, I think, Justin, I really believe that the civil rights movement have inspired not just African American, but all American. I spent time with Native American. I've gone to Window Rock in Arizona and spent time with the Navajo and other members of the Native American community. And anytime any segment of the society is being discriminated against, we all are being discriminated against. The last time I saw Martin Luther King Jr. alive was in March of 1968 at a little restaurant in Atlanta. He was trying to create something called the Poor People's Campaign. He was bringing together in that room was black, white, Native American, Hispanic, Asian American. It was little America all together.
How did you convince like Caucasian people to join in on the sit-ins? Because I would feel that there would probably be a sense of fear. How did you like convince them to sit in with you guys?
Well, there was many white Southerners and white people not necessarily from the South, but many in the South saw segregation. They felt it was wrong. Many white students participated. And for many occasions, some of the greatest violence was heaped on those white participants because people saw them as betraying the race, and they were called in-lovers. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And some of my white colleagues and friends that grew up in Alabama, in Georgia, and from other parts of America were severely beaten because of their participation. There was a white minister who was beaten and later died. There were others in Alabama, in Georgia, in Mississippi who had to leave the state and go someplace else to live.
Do you think that the white participants helped you guys do what you had to do? Do you think people that believed in segregation started to join and started to get different views of how things were starting to were going to happen?
The whites that participated did make a contribution, a great contribution. And there have been white people in the South that believed in segregation, and later they changed. I was back in Birmingham not too many years ago after taking a trip with some of my colleagues from the Congress. We went to Birmingham, to Selma, and to Montgomery. And a middle-aged white man came up and he said to me, "Congressman Lewis, I want to apologize to you on behalf of all of the white people of Alabama for what we did." And you hear white people all across the South saying, "You're not just freed the black community, you freed all of us."
Representative Lewis, talk a little bit about the Freedom Rides, how they came about. We know that there was many white people who were on those Freedom Rides as well. How did that come about?
The Freedom Rides started in May of 1961 to test a decision of the United States Supreme Court banning segregation and racial discrimination in public transportation. We met in Washington, D.C. on May 1st, 1961 to go through a period of orientation. There was 13 of us on the original ride, 7 whites and 6 blacks. In 1961, it would be impossible for an interracial group to board a Greyhound bus or a Trailway bus and traveled from Washington, D.C., through Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, into Alabama, Mississippi, into New Orleans, and that's what our itinerary. You go into a so-called white waiting room, and in this so-called white waiting room, there's a barber shop. And one young black man tried to get a shoe shine in the so-called white barber shop. He was arrested and taken to jail. The next day, the charges were dropped, and he was released from jail. My seatmate, a white gentleman, the two of us tried to enter a so-called white waiting room in a little town in South Carolina, Rock Hill, South Carolina. An angry mob met us at the door of the waiting room, beat us, and left us lying in a pool of blood. And the freedom rides continued through Georgia into Alabama. The bus was attacked and burned between Atlanta and Birmingham. And then the angry mob that grew to more than 3,000 people met us in Montgomery and beat us and left us bloody and unconscious. The freedom rides continued into Mississippi, where we all were jailed. More than 300 people were jailed. And the great majority of those young people that came from all across America were young whites to participate in the freedom ride. We filled the city jail in Jackson, Mississippi, the county jail, and later they transferred us to the state penitentiary at Parchment. But most of us stayed up to 40 days and we got out. But it led to the desegregation of public transportation all across the South. We changed the South forever during the freedom ride. It was easy. It was easy in a way. It was simple in a way. You buy a ticket, you board a bus, blacks go to the front of the bus, whites go to the back of the bus. You go to a so-called white waiting room as an interracial group, and you sit and wait. Or you go to a so-called colored waiting room, an interracial group, and you get arrested, you go to jail. But it was dangerous. It was very dangerous to go on the freedom ride.
When you look back on all you've accomplished, I mean, how does that feel? Like, I can only imagine how much pride you must feel to have gone through all that, and here you are today, successful. Just, what does it feel like today looking back on what you've been through?
Well, if I go back to places like Selma, to Birmingham or Nashville, back to the area where I grew up and see the changes, I'm very proud. But I'm proud to see people taking advantages, really taking advantage of the doors of opportunity, the doors that we open. And the little town near where I grew up is different. It is so much better. People were so afraid. There was so much fear. The fear is gone. Those signs are gone. And people are living and getting along like people should get along.
Talk a little bit more about Selma, the march there, what it meant to the movement and to you as well.
Selma, this little sleepy town in the heart of the Black Belt of Alabama, near the Alabama River. It's about 50 miles south of Montgomery. It was a mean place. You had a sheriff there by the name of Jim Clark. He was a very big man, mean, tall, mean. A lot of white people were afraid of him. The black people were afraid of him. He wore a gun on one side, a nightstick on the other side, and he carried an electric caparata in his hand, and he didn't use it on cows. He wore a button on his left lapel that said never. And people would go, teachers, high school principals, like lawyers and doctors, would go day in, day out, trying to get a copy of the so-called literacy test, to pass the test to become a registered voter. And he would block their entrance to the courthouse. We went down one day, and he just started beating people. There was a young minister who worked with Dr. King, just beat him. And this minister pleaded to him, said, if you're going to beat us so the world can see. And he just continued to beat this young minister. He called me an outside agitator, a troublemaker, then had me arrested and taken to jail. But after a series of nonviolent protests in Selma, and a young man being beaten, shot, and killed, we attempted to march from Selma to Montgomery on March 7, 1965. At that time, I was 25 years old, head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, one of the major civil rights groups. We made it to the highest point on the bridge, in the Pettus Bridge crossing the Alabama River. Down below we saw a sea of blue, Alabama State Troopers. We saw members of Sheriff Clark's posse. He had requested that all white men over the age of 21 to come down to the courthouse the night before to be deputized to become part of his posse to stop the march. So when we got near the foot of the bridge, a major of the Alabama State Troopers said, "This is an unlawful march, will not be allowed to continue. I give you 3 minutes to disperse and return to your church." In less than a minute and a half, he said, "Troopers, advance." You saw these men putting on their gas masks. They came toward us, beating us with nightsticks and bullwhips, trampling us with horses, releasing their tear gas. I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. Had a concussion at the bridge. I thought I was going to die. I thought I saw death. 40 years later, I don't recall how I made it across that bridge back to that little church that we had left from. But I recall being at the church that Sunday afternoon, and someone asked me to say something to the audience. And I stood up and said something like, "I don't understand it. How President Johnson can send troops to Vietnam, but cannot send troops to Selma, Alabama, to protect people who only desires to register to vote." The next thing I knew, I'd been admitted to this little hospital in Selma. The next day, Dr. King came by to visit me and said, "Don't worry, John, we'll make it from Selma to Montgomery." And we did. And when we left Selma, it was not just the 600 of us, but there was more than 10,000 blacks and white citizens. And when we arrived in Montgomery, there were more than 25,000 people. I remember one day when we were walking from Selma to Montgomery. It was a 5-day walk. It rained, it thundered, it lightened. Dr. King was wearing a cap on his head. He took the cap off and placed it on my head. And he said, "John, you need to wear this cap. You've been hurt. You need to protect your head." I would never forget that kind act on his part. But that effort changed Selma. And today in Selma, you have a black mayor, you have an interracial city council, black judges, black fire chief, black chief of police. So it's a different world. In 1965, when we walked across that bridge, only 2.1% of blacks of voting age were registered to vote. 1963, you must keep in mind in 1963, the summer of 1963, Medgar Evers, an NAACP leader, had been assassinated in Mississippi. Bull Connor had used the dogs and fire hoses on young children, young women in Birmingham. Been hundreds and thousands of people have been arrested in jail. And we had a meeting with President Kennedy in June of '63, and in that meeting we told him that we were going to march on Washington. And a few days later, we went all across America recruiting people. And hundreds and thousands of people came from the state of Minnesota, from all over America, all over to march. And I remember so well that day. Even before that day, I was working on my speech for the March on Washington. I was one of the speakers. And I was reading a copy of the New York Times, and I saw a group of black women in Southern Africa carrying signs saying, "One man, one vote." So in my March on Washington speech, I said something like, "One man, one vote is the African cry. It is ours too. It must be ours." And when they introduced me to speak, I stood up. More than 250,000 people. I looked to my left, I looked to my right, I looked straight ahead, and I said to myself, "This is it." And I started speaking, and it went well. And when Dr. King got up to speak, I tell you, I've heard Dr. King speak so many times, but on this day, he spoke from his gut. He spoke from his soul, and when he started saying, "I have a dream today, a dream that is deeply rooted in American dream," you feel like you just want to say, "Hallelujah." We knew then that we were going to make it. It's going to be all right.
My question pertains especially to the Selma March. How did you prepare yourself to know that you were leading all of these people over that bridge and that possibly they could be killed and injured? How did you prepare yourself knowing that you were in the front of that you would have to look Sheriff Clark in the eyes and say, "We're doing it"?
Well, on that day of the march from Selma to Montgomery, we conducted a nonviolent workshop. We had a prayer. We had a song, and it was to be quiet and silent. And we just, only thing you can hear is sort of pick them up, lay them down. It was like military discipline. I thought we would be arrested. I didn't have any idea that we would be beaten. But when I saw the state troopers and members of Sheriff Clark posse with that gas mask on, and I saw men on horseback, I knew something was going to happen. And we sort of made arrangement for the men to be in the front and in the back, and the children, the women would be in the center. My greatest fear, my greatest concern was when I was there on the ground and before I lost consciousness of what was happening to the other people. I felt a sense of responsibility. But in the movement, we knew it was a possibility that any of us could be beaten or killed. So we were prepared to die if necessary.
In John Lewis's autobiography,